In this episode, we deal with a situation that every organization eventually faces, even if they do not like to admit it: emergencies. An emergency change is a change that must happen quickly because waiting would create unacceptable risk, such as ongoing harm to users, clear policy violations, active security threats, or a rapidly escalating operational failure. For brand new learners, it helps to think of an emergency change like pulling a fire alarm, because you do not do it casually, but when you must do it, you cannot spend hours debating. In AI systems, emergencies are especially tricky because changes can alter outcomes immediately, and the pressure to act fast can cause teams to skip safeguards that normally prevent mistakes. Auditing emergency changes means verifying that speed did not replace control and that the organization still made accountable decisions, captured evidence, and protected people during the rush. The goal is not to prevent emergency action, because sometimes action is the responsible choice, but to ensure emergency action is disciplined rather than chaotic. In Task 13 terms, this is where change management shows its maturity, because a strong program works even under stress. By the end, you should understand why emergency changes happen, what makes them risky in AI, and what controls and evidence auditors expect to see when the organization moves fast. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first concept to understand is what counts as an emergency for an AI system, because not every urgent request is truly emergency level. An emergency is usually defined by potential impact and time sensitivity, meaning harm is happening or likely to happen soon, and delaying action increases damage. Examples include an AI system producing unsafe recommendations, a model showing signs of being manipulated, a sudden spike in severe errors that affects many people, or a discovery that the system violates a policy boundary, such as using prohibited data. Beginners should understand that emergencies can be technical, like a data pipeline failure, but they can also be governance-driven, like a new legal restriction or a discovery of unfair outcomes. Auditors look for criteria that define emergency conditions, because without criteria, teams may label routine changes as emergency changes to bypass controls. This is a classic control failure, where the emergency pathway becomes the normal pathway. A mature organization defines emergency triggers clearly and requires documentation of why the event met those triggers. The audit mindset is that emergencies are real, but they must be provable, not just declared. Emergency changes are risky in AI because the system's behavior can shift in ways that are difficult to predict quickly, especially if the change affects model logic, thresholds, or data sources. Under pressure, teams may focus on stopping the immediate harm and overlook secondary effects, such as increasing false positives, causing service disruptions, or creating new fairness issues. This is why emergency change management often prioritizes containment, meaning reducing harm quickly, even if the solution is temporary or conservative. For beginners, imagine turning off a powerful machine that is malfunctioning, even if turning it off slows production, because safety comes first. In AI, containment might mean pausing automation, routing decisions to human review, narrowing the model's scope, or reverting to a known safer version. Auditors evaluate whether the chosen emergency action was appropriate for the risk and whether it minimized harm to affected people. They also examine whether the organization considered the impact of doing nothing, because sometimes the emergency action itself creates risk if it is poorly chosen. Emergency change controls should guide teams towards safer defaults rather than risky improvisation. A key audit question is whether emergency changes follow an approved emergency pathway with defined roles and authority. In a crisis, people need to know who can authorize actions, who executes them, and who communicates status. Without clear authority, teams may hesitate and delay, or multiple teams may make conflicting changes, increasing chaos. Auditors look for evidence that the organization has an incident-like structure for emergency changes, including an accountable decision-maker who can accept risk on behalf of the organization. They also look for separation between decision and execution where possible, because it reduces the chance of a single person making an unchecked mistake. Beginners should think of this like a hospital emergency, where someone leads, others carry out tasks, and actions are documented. Even when time is tight, discipline matters because discipline prevents secondary accidents. A strong emergency pathway is designed to be usable under stress, not complicated and fragile. Documentation during emergencies is another area where audit-grade evaluation is critical because the temptation is to skip recording details and focus only on action. Auditors understand that perfect documentation during a crisis is unrealistic, but they still expect key facts to be captured, such as what happened, when it was discovered, what risk it created, what actions were taken, who authorized them, and what version or configuration was changed. This minimal record is essential for learning, accountability, and compliance after the emergency ends. Beginners should understand that without a record, the organization cannot prove it acted responsibly, and it cannot reliably prevent the same failure from happening again. Documentation also supports later analysis to determine whether the emergency change introduced new problems or whether the original problem had multiple causes. A mature approach treats documentation as part of response, not as optional paperwork. Auditors will look for a pattern of consistent emergency records, even if brief, because consistency signals a disciplined process. Testing in an emergency is a balancing act, because some testing is always better than none, but the organization cannot always run the full normal suite. Auditors therefore look for evidence that the organization performed risk-based testing, meaning it tested the most critical behaviors and the most likely failure points related to the emergency. For example, if the emergency change is to tighten a threshold to reduce harmful decisions, the organization should test whether the tighter threshold causes an unacceptable spike in false positives or operational workload. If the emergency change is to roll back to a prior model, the organization should verify compatibility with current data feeds and confirm the rollback will not crash the workflow. Beginners should see this as triage testing, where the goal is to prevent obvious new harm while responding quickly. A strong program also includes predefined emergency test packs, meaning a small set of essential checks that can be run fast because they were designed ahead of time. Auditors value this because it shows the organization prepared for emergencies rather than relying on improvisation. Communication controls matter during emergency changes because people need to understand what the system is doing and what has changed. If the AI system affects user-facing decisions, internal teams must be informed so they can interpret outcomes correctly and respond to questions or complaints. Auditors look for evidence that communication was timely, accurate, and appropriately scoped without sharing sensitive details unnecessarily. They also check that communications align with policy, such as not claiming certainty when the system is operating in a degraded or emergency mode. Beginners should understand that communication is a safety control because misinformation causes secondary harm, like staff taking incorrect actions or customers losing trust due to inconsistent responses. A strong emergency change process includes clear messages about temporary measures, expected impacts, and what to do if additional issues are observed. It also includes a plan for restoring normal operations, because emergency mode should not become the permanent state without deliberate decision. In AI systems, where behavior can be subtle, communication reduces confusion and prevents misuse. Rollback and reversibility are especially important for emergency changes, because fast fixes can have unexpected side effects. Auditors examine whether the organization can reverse the emergency change if it makes things worse, and whether the organization monitored outcomes closely after the emergency action. This is where emergency change management overlaps with monitoring and incident triggers, because the organization should watch for signs that the emergency measure is causing new harm. Beginners can think of this as taking a strong medicine. It may address the immediate problem, but you must monitor for side effects. A mature organization sets short review cycles after emergency changes, meaning it checks quickly whether the action worked and whether further adjustment is needed. It also ensures that emergency changes are tracked so they are not forgotten, because a temporary workaround that stays forever can become a hidden risk. Auditors often find that emergency fixes remain in place without proper review, which is why post-emergency governance is part of the audit focus. Post-emergency review is one of the most important controls because it turns a crisis into learning rather than repeated failure. Auditors look for evidence that the organization performed a structured review after stability returned, including what caused the emergency, what controls failed, what could have detected the issue earlier, and what permanent fixes are required. They also look for whether the emergency change was converted into a normal change process afterward, meaning the organization completes full testing, proper approvals, and documentation once time pressure is reduced. Beginners should understand that emergency changes are often justified by urgency, but urgency does not justify skipping accountability forever. A strong program treats emergency changes as provisional and requires follow-up to ensure the system is safe and compliant long-term. This review also includes checking whether any data cleanup or evidence preservation is needed, especially if the emergency involved harmful outcomes or suspected malicious activity. The goal is to close the loop so the organization gets better at preventing and handling future emergencies. A common misconception is that emergency changes are always technical, but many emergencies are actually governance failures that were ignored until they became urgent. For example, a model might have been drifting for months, but no one monitored it properly, and then suddenly the impact becomes severe and requires emergency action. Auditors therefore look for patterns, because frequent emergencies can indicate poor planning, weak monitoring, or a culture that postpones controls. Another misconception is that speed and control are incompatible, but mature organizations prove the opposite by preparing emergency pathways, defining authority, and creating minimal test packs and documentation templates. Beginners should see that good emergency change management is an investment made before the crisis, not something invented during the crisis. When organizations prepare, they can move quickly without losing discipline, which protects both people and operations. Audit-grade evaluation focuses on whether the organization's emergency response looked like practiced control or like panic. To make this concrete, imagine an AI system that helps detect unsafe content in a platform, and suddenly it begins allowing a surge of harmful outputs due to a data feed issue or an adversarial trend. Waiting days to run full tests could allow real harm, so the organization might temporarily tighten filtering, route more cases to human review, or roll back to a prior version. An auditor would ask whether the emergency decision was authorized by the right owner, whether the actions were documented, whether essential tests were performed to avoid obvious new harm, and whether monitoring was heightened afterward. They would also ask whether the organization communicated clearly to operational teams about the temporary change and whether a post-emergency review was conducted to prevent recurrence. The lesson is that emergency changes are judged not only by intent, but by discipline, evidence, and follow-through. Even when acting fast, the organization must prove it maintained responsible control. For beginners, this example shows how emergency change management protects people by enabling fast containment without turning the system into chaos. When you step back, auditing emergency changes for AI is about verifying that the organization can act quickly when risk demands it while still preserving accountability, evidence, and safety boundaries. The evaluator looks for clear criteria that define emergencies, defined authority and roles, minimal but sufficient documentation, risk-based testing, effective communication, strong monitoring and reversibility, and a structured post-emergency review that converts temporary measures into controlled long-term fixes. For brand-new learners, the central takeaway is that emergencies are not excuses to abandon governance. They are the moments when governance matters most because the cost of mistakes is highest. A mature AI change management program is one that holds together under stress, guiding teams towards safer actions and making it possible to prove that speed did not come at the expense of responsibility. If you can explain how emergency changes should be controlled and what evidence auditors expect to see, you have built a core Task 13 competency, evaluating whether an organization can manage urgent AI risk without losing discipline and trust.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.